I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this is my 1,000-kilometre review of the Volkswagen Golf GTI Mk. To say that the Golf GTI is an important hot hatch would be an understatement. The GTI was the progenitor of the hot hatch segment. This one is the 8th generation version, and it's safe to say that the Golf GTI has come an awfully long way from its humble origins. This is now a fully featured, luxurious, refined hatchback that also promises a decent amount of punch, but a familiar amount of punch, because what's under the bonnet of the new Mark 8 GTI is the same as what you got in the Mark 7.5 GTI, and the chassis underneath is broadly the same as well, albeit with a few refinements added on. So in today's video, we're going to talk about whether this really is the hot hatch you should be buying, and whether the new Golf GTI justifies its substantially increased price over its predecessor. So we'll do our usual thing. We'll have a look at the interior of the Mark 8 GTI, we'll check out the back seats and the boot, we'll discuss the running costs, and then we'll head out onto the road for a detailed review of the driving dynamics of this Golf GTI. But also as a bonus, we'll also hit the track and talk about the limit handling of this car and whether it can stand up to rivals like the i30N and the Focus ST. Before we get started, hit subscribe down below the video. There's been a massive change to the cabin of the Mark 8 GTI compared to the Mark 7.5. In fact, the interior might be the thing that's changed the most about this hot hatch compared to last year's version. We'll come back to how the interior works in just a second though. First of all, let's talk about the price, which has gone up. The Mark 8 GTI now starts at $53,100, and it's difficult not to think of cars like the Mark 7.5 GTI Original that were under 40 grand drive away for a very similar mechanical package. Now, of course, these days you can only get the GTI with the full fat 180 kilowatt and proper diff instead of the old 162, 169 kilowatt packages. But the other thing that's changed is Volkswagen now really throw the kitchen sink at the car in terms of standard features. And the base interior on the GTI is very nice indeed, but you can make it even nicer. First of all, the King's Red paint outside, that's a new red, replaces the flat tornado red of the old GTI. It's now metallic and a shade darker, but it costs you $300. The other colors on the car are actually free. Now, the car I'm sitting in is optioned up to the max. So first of all, we have the $3,800 luxury package. That gives you these actually very nice and comfortable leather seats with electric adjustment and memory for the driver, heating and cooling for the driver and the passenger. It's a pretty nice feature on a small car like this, but keep in mind the passenger seat, unlike the Mark 7.5, doesn't have electric adjustment, and that's a bit of a shame, but even so, as it's set, it's already in a pretty good position. The luxury package also gives us the sunroof up here, a nice feature to have, and a heated steering wheel, which is a feature you don't think you need until you have it on a car. After that, we have a $1,500 sound and vision package, which gives us the head-up display and also a Harman Kardon stereo, and both of those features work well. If you just go for the basic GTI though, you get manual cloth seats in tartan and no sunroof, and in my opinion, that's probably the way I would go. All of the technology though, which is very different and very new, that is all standard. So the GTI gets Volkswagen's InnoVision cockpit, which is the pairing of these two 10.25 inch displays up here on the dash. Now the one in front of you, the virtual cockpit, that works really well. Volkswagen have simplified the functionality a little bit, increased the resolution, made it faster and snappier, and it's much easier to use with the shortcut keys here on the steering wheel to change the right-hand panel, the left-hand panel, or you can dismiss that information and just have a full map in the center. That's brilliant, best in class. Unfortunately, the center touchscreen isn't best in class. It tries to do a lot, and some of the basic functionality is quite impressive, and the simplicity and the design of the software is nice, but the screen is nowhere near responsive enough. It's too laggy too much of the time, and many of the touch targets are genuinely difficult to hit. For example, the now playing screen requires a seriously precise touch, dragging down the shortcuts of the car where you find the ESC options, the start-stop options. That again requires incredible precision when you're driving on the move, and in a country like Australia with bumpy roads, it's too difficult. The old touchscreen on the Mark 7 GTI was easier to use. But that being said, having done so many Ks on this car, I eventually found a setting on the screen that I liked. I set up the virtual cockpit to my liking, generally ran wireless CarPlay over here, which is standard, and I kind of forgot all about those issues. But if you always like changing your settings on the screen, you'll find it frustrating. At least the material quality is generally good. We've got lots of squidgy materials, actually softer touch doors than the Mark 7, which is really good. But some of the secondary plastics down here are scratchier than they were before. And speaking of this center tunnel, we've got a stubby little gear shifter instead of the old, more substantial item. No manual for Australia. Very clever wireless charger with an additional shelf, big cup holders, decent sized center bin with an adjustable armrest. All in all, it feels premium. Does it feel 65 grand drive away? That question is up to you. One thing that's absolutely tremendous about the Golf GTI, and always has been, is the size and the packaging. This car is smaller outside than many of its rivals, and that makes it a great partner for slicing and dicing around city traffic. You really can dive into gaps. But then out on a country road, it feels substantial, and on the highway, you do appreciate the fact that it's a size up on something like a Polo GTI, I would say. But what Volkswagen have been able to do is package the car really well in the back seat, despite the fact that outside it's not huge. So for myself at 6 foot, sitting behind my own driving position, you can see I have a comfortable amount of space. Headroom, I've got plenty of it, despite the fact we do have a sunroof up front. Legroom, I've got an inch or so. Toe room is no problem at all. This seat is where I would have it, as I said. Now, getting a fifth person into the back is going to be a bit of a challenge, but as a car for 4 adults to go away for the weekend, it's fine. Boot space would probably be the main limiting factor there. We do have standard air vents. We've got a separate climate zone back here, or temperature zone, I should say. We've got an armrest, flips down, 2.5 cup holders, pass through to the boot as well, plus a few more pockets than before. Map pockets in both seats, but also both seats have these little occasional pockets in them, though all of those plastics back here are scratchy. In an i30N, you actually do get soft touch rear doors, though in a hot hatch, that's probably not the first consideration. Here around the back of the Mark 8 GTI, it is a simplified design, a little bit grubby after putting 1,000 Ks on the car, but hey, that's what's gonna happen when you do one of these tests properly. Now we have the GTI badge in the center, that's moved from here on the bottom left. Still all red, signifying the fact that this car does have a proper diff on the front. Well, that's what a full red GTI badge used to mean anyway. New Volkswagen badge as well. I like the tail lights here on the back. I actually think the Mark 8 looks better from the back than from the front. But out of all the Mark 8 variants, the GTI wears it the best, this new design, in my opinion. Still a manual tailgate and still very much the same boot area as the Mark 7.5. It all looks the same. We still have the dual height boot floor. That means you'll be able to cram more stuff in. 381 litres of boot space. That's 1 litre more than last year's model, but hey, every litre counts. And then beneath that boot floor, you also have a space saver spare for these 18-inch wheels and tyres, and the boot itself is nice and easy to close. Next up, and just before we head out onto the road, let's chat running costs. First up, insurance. In the last 12 months, the median budget direct customer spent $985 to insure a new Volkswagen Golf. Now that data is for all Golf models, from the very base model right up through to the R, just something to keep in mind. Now, everybody's situation varies and your premium will vary based on things insurers take into account, like where you live, how you garage the car, who drives the car, your driving history, etc. In terms of servicing, it really does pay dividends to buy a service plan up front on the Golf GTI. Now, these cost $1,400 for 3 years or $2,450 for 5 years. The intervals are 12 months or 15,000 Ks, and basically it just helps to bring down the cost of the super expensive 4th year service, that package. The warranty on the car is 5 years with unlimited kilometers. And lastly, fuel consumption. Well, it's actually fairly manageable in the Golf GTI, and the Mark 8 has actually improved slightly on the Mark 7.5 in this regard. Now, if you're on it, you're really exploiting the performance. You'll see 10 or 11 litres per 100 Ks. On the highway, you'll be able to get 6.5 litres per 100 without trying, or about 8 litres in combined driving. And personally, I think that's pretty good given the performance on tap. So then, what's the new Golf GTI like to drive? Well, I'll do this in 2 parts. First of all, I'll talk about how the car goes on road, which is what matters most in a hot hatch, according to me at least. But then after this, we will take the GTI out on track so that we can get a better idea of its limit handling away from the dangers of driving on a public road. First of all, what have we got under the bonnet? Well, very similar package to the Mark 7.5, but that isn't necessarily that bad. So we still have a 180 kilowatt, 370 newton meter, 2 litre turbocharged petrol 4-cylinder engine here in the Golf GTI. Front wheel drive, as the GTI always has been. That's part of the hallmark of this badge. And it's hooked up to a 7-speed wet clutch DSG dual clutch automatic gearbox. Plus, because we have the 180 kilowatt version of the engine, we have a true mechanically locking, electronically controlled limited slip differential on the front axle, and that is an important inclusion. It just means that the GTI can really claw its way through the corners, or out of corners I really should say, whereas the behavior of the Mark 7 GTI when it was equipped with an open diff was that you got a lot more wheel spin as that front inside wheel was unladen on your way out of a corner, particularly a curved uphill corner where that wheel just didn't have any weight on it. It would just spin up. And then of course the i30N came out with its standard differential, locking differential here in Australia, and that started to mean that hot hatches were regarded as kind of needing a true LSD there in order to counter that wheel spin. And the Golf has had one standard since I think model year 2018, and it's just part of the character of how the GTI drives now. It's a quick car, it's a capable car, and you can actually get on the power pretty early on a good road or on track, as we'll see very shortly. Now, to be completely honest with you, the dynamics of the car, at least at road speeds, haven't changed massively compared to the Mark 7.5, and I'm personally quite happy about that fact. That's because the Mark 7.5 GTI was still one of my favorite hot hatches, and that doesn't change just because it has a new body and this whiz-bang new interior. The Golf GTI still has a very cohesive attitude on the road. It rides well, it steers well, it's composed, it's predictable, the chassis talks to you about what it's doing and where it's going on the road. The tyres are communicative, the view out is good, you sit nice and low. So the fundamentals of the car are really solid, and they still are in Mark 8 form. What has changed though is the price, and there's no avoiding the fact that the GTI does sit in a different position vis-a-vis its rivals than it used to. It's quite a lot more expensive than an i30N, even with the recent bump to i30N prices. It's a lot more expensive than a Focus ST, although the Focus ST base models are certainly not as well equipped as a Golf GTI base model, but it does cost more to buy a Golf GTI than its rivals is a pretty good rule of thumb. But the dynamics are admittedly more mature than many of its rivals. It's quite light, and it feels quite light to drive, and just things like the really well thought out wheel and tyre size and the partnership with adaptive dampers, which have many more settings now, give the GTI a really pleasant demeanour. And I do want to touch on that wheel and tyre package, because that is where there's quite a change compared to a high-spec Mark 7.5 GTI. Now, if you wanted to get the sound and style package on the Mark 7.5, which gave you better looking wheels, it gave you a better stereo and a whole bunch of other options kind of randomly thrown together, you got upgraded to 19-inch wheels and Pirelli P0 tyres, and I had those on my long-term GTI. For any long-running subscribers to the channel, you'll remember that. Now, those 19-inch wheels looked fantastic. They looked better than the 18s on this car, but they didn't ride anywhere nearly as well. Now we have quite a nice combination, a fully specified Golf GTI with all the options, but sensible 18-inch wheels, back to Bridgestone Potenza tyres, which don't have as much outright grip, but they're very chatty and they let you move the chassis around the road, and we still have adaptive dampers. Now that's kind of a golden combination, because the GTI rides brilliantly in Mark 8 form. It is so comfortable. There's like 15 or 20 settings on the dampers, but I found just to the comfort side of normal was absolutely perfect. The car has a tiny bit of roll, but that relieves the tyres, they never get squealy on road, and the car just soaks up urban imperfections so well. it honestly rides more like a luxury car than a mainstream hatch. It's been really, really well done. And yes, those tyres do let you play a lot more with the balance and the placement of the GTI on the road, and that, in my books, is a good thing. You know, little lift-off oversteer moments and whatnot happen more often on these Bridgestones than they do on the Pirellis, which never felt that friendly to me on my long-termer. By the time they gave way, you were doing big speeds and you had a bit more to worry about. Also, the ESC does now have a fully off option. It always had ESC Sport on the previous gen GTI, but ESC off is probably something best left to the track most of the time, and we'll go there in a second. Just a couple of extra words. It's a little bit more fuel efficient in our real world testing. There's probably a combination of factors behind that. It's still reasonably refined in the cabin, a little less noisy than on the 19s and Pirellis, but it's still, you know, you can tell when you're going over a coarse chip road. That's certainly a fact. One thing that is a huge improvement though is the safety tech package is really broad now. Really, really good active cruise and lane keep assist in what Volkswagen call travel assist. AEB, reversing AEB, blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert, junction AEB as well. That's a good feature, but no 360-degree camera. Now, they're not common on small cars like this, but it is certainly a nice to have. All right, let's do a lap and see how the new GTI fares on track. All right, Golf GTI, let's have a quick track blat, see what's changed out here. Not because that many people track their GTIs, but because a great closed environment like this just lets us reach those higher limits of the car in a safer spot, basically, and it's fun. So hey, now as I mentioned up front, there's a lot of similarities in the Mark 8 GTI to the Mark 7, same MQB platform, though with a few alterations, and the same 2-litre turbo petrol 4-cylinder engine, the EA888. Same outputs even, 180 kilowatts of power and 370 newton meters of torque. Same 7-speed wet clutch DSG. We've got, again, the electronically controlled, mechanically locking limited slip differential on the front axle, but we also have a number of changes which Volkswagen say are more about brains than brawn. And it makes sense to kind of pitch the GTI that way because, well, unless the 221 kilowatt TCR Mark 8 gets brought to Australia, which it might, there's no avoiding the fact that GTI is a little down on rivals compared to power, but there's been a power war in hot hatches for the last 3 or 4 years. The Golf GTI itself played that game in Mark 7 form, where it moved from 162 to 169 to 180 kilowatts in its lifespan. Could well see the same thing happening again on the Mark 8, but key people at Volkswagen tell me the story is more than numbers for the GTI, which is true, but have a listen. There's still a good amount of brawn to this car. I don't think there's too much to be embarrassed about, particularly because the GTI is a lot lighter than many of its key rivals. i30N, Focus ST, they're both porkers. The Golf is a demonstration of how lightness can be a huge help in a car like this. You can really throw it around, which is one of the beautiful things of all MQB vehicles, but particularly ones that have less inhibitions. And that's one of the first changes to the Mark 8, is there's now a full stability control off mode. There was always ESC Sport beforehand, but now you can turn it all the way off. Now there's still a lot of mechanical grip to the Mark 8. It's not gonna be easy to lose it in a huge slide, but there are lots of little pockets of lift-off oversteer that the GTI gives you. It always did in Mark 7, Mark 6 form as well, but now that you can just turn those nannies right off, you get a lot more latitude. The next change is an improvement to the brakes. Now the brakes themselves are not as big as that last of the line Mark 7.5 TCR, which was the last GTI I drove around this circuit, But we do now have an electronic brake booster, we've got a larger brake master cylinder, and those things combine to create faster response and more natural pedal feel. And you can feel that. We've got a fettled exhaust. Sounds fantastic. Doesn't sound contrived like some hot hatches tend to. Doesn't have an artificial kind of bass to it. Instead, it's raspy, zesty, but there's noticeable crackles on the overrun now. Snaps at times, and of course, still the DSG upshift farts. Now that diff continues to be one of the good ones. It works hard, bites really well. You can get on the power a lot quicker in the GTI with a proper diff than you could with the old open diff one. You know, you can really surprise yourself by going for the power pretty early and pretty hard. But honestly, that's not the fastest way to drive the GTI. Still, it's quicker to drive this car as if it doesn't have the tricky diff. No doubt it does help on certain tracks and certain roads, but the GTI continues to reward smoothness above anything else, really. Just wait until you got the wheels pretty much straight and then get hard into this willing 2-litre engine. There's a lot here for fans of front drive hot hatches like me. But of course, if you want more, and if you want something really more suited to this kind of track work, next year's R will be the name of the game. 235 kilowatts, so it's a lot more powerful. Drift mode, better tires, louder exhaust. So that may be worth waiting for if those are your attributes you're looking for. But the GTI continues to be a satisfying drive, even though we do have to acknowledge it's a lot more costly this time around. So those are my impressions of the new Volkswagen Golf GTI Mk. A great hot hatch if you're looking for the whole package in a front driver. This thing has crisp and creamy dynamics, excellent ride, a good punchy engine, but it also has all of those luxurious mod cons that you might be looking for in a new car. That does make the Golf GTI considerably more expensive than some of its rivals, and so there is a question of value for money. But if you're looking for a hot hatch with all of those inclusions, then you would have to go and test drive the new Mk GTI, which remains a really good drive. Keen to know your thoughts though, let me know in the comments. While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.